You still love me after today. Uh, this morning, I really, and we're still in our series on why God's not boring, and I'll share with you a little bit later why I'm hoping you still love me after this message. But this morning, we're continuing our why God's not boring, and we're looking at something that, we talked about how great He is in worship in the church. And this morning we're going to look at why He's not boring because of something, rally towel and white ball towel, of how He is always there. And so I don't know about you, when I first think of storms, my first thought is the movie Twister. And I remember going to the movie, and it was like one of the first real good graphic type movies. And the only thing I can always think of, more than Helen Hunt and the Joe Paxton guy or whatever that was in it, was the scene when they're driving through and the cow. And the cow turning and spinning, and I don't know why. And when I Googled that this week and I said Twister scene, cow popped up because it almost knew what I was going to be asking. But this morning, and I'm sure all of us can think of times when you've been in a storm, like weather-wise. We'll talk about the other storms in a moment, but weather-wise, and Twister comes to it. I really only have a couple. I don't have a memory of seeing a tornado and driving toward it or driving away from it. I guess three. One, I remember being young and going to down around from where we live. Betty lived in Kent, had a storm cellar, and I remember going in that one time because a tornado was nearby. My other two, and I've told one of them, is the flooding story where me and my buddy Brian Hunt were stranded in, Abilene. Whoever engineered Abilene, I'm sorry, this will be on YouTube. If it spits, some streets flood. And we're driving this car, or wasn't driving, and Freddie started running through. So I remember being flooded. And then the other one was, and Jaden will appreciate this because I'm sorry, it's a golf story, but we were at a golf tournament, and me and my buddy Kyle McVeigh was in a tournament, and it started to rain, and we were on the farthest side of the golf course when it starts to rain. But not only does it start to rain, as we start driving, it starts hailing. And we look like the two guys on Dumb and Dumber on the moped. We were so scooted in on that golf cart and just getting pelted with hailstones, and some of them hurt. I'm glad. If I was little back then, hang on, let me rephrase that. I'm a lot bigger than I was in high school, let's face it. I'm glad I had that body to take on the hailstorms than the 130-pound high school kid. But we all have different storm stories, and I'm sure if we went around, you probably have one where you saw a tornado outside of town or whatever. But this morning, it's kind of a heavy topic, but it's not. But it's knowing that our God's not boring, because even though we're going to face some storms, we never face them by ourselves. We know that storms are going to come. Jesus told us in John chapter 16 to take heart. You're going to have some trouble, but I've overcome the world. And so He tells us all these things, that storms are going to come. And so we're going to look at today on how do we handle those. And there's three different areas where we're going to look at storms when Jesus talks about different storms. Once He is experiencing it. And if you have a Bible, turn to Matthew chapter 7. And so as we look and think about storms today, the first thing that we need to understand is not all storms are the same for everyone. But let's look at Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 24. Again, John 16:33 said, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." Jesus tells us, we read in the Bible, people that go through different storms and times in their lives that are tough. And sometimes storms come and we don't even know it, and sometimes storms come because of the decisions we make in our lives. But the bottom line is, in this world, we are going to have some storms that come our way. And the first thing that's important when it comes to those storms is here in Jesus' teaching about how we kind of prepare for those. Matthew chapter 7, beginning verse 24. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a man who has built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teachings, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. First thing, when Jesus goes to tell us anything, they tell you right there how much authority he has, but how important it is, and I go back and we talked a little bit about it in Sunday school, is knowing that the storms are going to come, knowing that the rain is going to happen. It's so, so important to be prepared. I guarantee you that when Hurricane Ian was coming, there were some that stuck around and said, you know what, we can take this on. You know, we can handle it. It always cracks me up, the weathermen that are out there getting blown away, taking trees to the knee. But there's people that knew when that hurricane was coming to get out of Dodge. Or they prepared in a way to leave. And that's what, when we build our foundation on Jesus Christ, and what I love about what Jesus says here, it's not only about having the foundation built, but he also says, taking these words of mine and putting them into practice. You know, it's real easy. It's like it's minor surgery, only if it's not happening to you. Oh, it's just a minor surgery, it'll be okay. Doc, I think it's major because it's my body. But when we start seeing that, it's putting into practice, knowing when those times come, knowing and relying on standing amazed in his presence, or standing on those promises that no matter when that storm comes, because there was a friend of mine that I used to listen to preach, and he always said when he taught from this story, it never says that the rain came on 2 different days. It says the rain and the storm came on the same day, but one house had the right foundation and one house didn't. And it's so important when that storm comes that we have the right foundation, because Jesus has told us it's going to come. Jesus has told us you will face trouble. It's going to happen. Maybe it's just because, maybe it's because of the decision, but he knows everything, and he says you are going to struggle, or you're going to have some issues that come and arise. So it's very important to make sure our foundation is set. The other thing that we need to understand, and this is the most human nature, and we talked about this in Sunday school. When our circumstances change, God never does. Who God is never changes with our circumstance. But many times when our circumstance change, our thoughts and talks to God change. God said, I'll never leave you, I'll never forsake you. I am who I am. I love you unconditionally. No matter what you go through, do not be discouraged, but be courageous. I am with you forever, always. But sometimes our enemy wants to come at us and say, you know what, maybe you need to doubt God during this storm. You need to doubt God. You know, if he wouldn't have left you there, you know, and the thing that we can relate to is that's what happened to Jesus. Oh, just turn this, Jesus, come on, Jesus. You can turn this rock into bread. Surely God doesn't want you to go hungry. You don't want to go hungry. But that's what Satan wants to do and the enemy wants to do. He wants our view of God to change when our circumstances change. But God says, I'm the same yesterday, today, and forever. He never changes. And that's why it's so important for us to make sure that we understand that our circumstances do not need to change our view of God. Flip over to Matthew chapter 8. Jesus just got done talking about the story of making sure your foundation's right. He's going through, they've heard the Sermon on the Mount. And in Matthew chapter 8, beginning in verse 23, Matthew, Mark, and Luke both share this story. I'm going to read it from Matthew. We'll look and see how sometimes how we view the circumstance sometimes changes. Matthew chapter 8, beginning verse 23. Then he got out into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. It's one of my favorite parts of that story. It reminds me that Jesus was like us and sometimes needed to sleep. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us. We're going to drown." Now, in the different stories, if you look there, and exclamation points or punctuation is important. When you're reading the Bible, sometimes that punctuation matters. For the wages of sin is death, but there's a comma involved. Here we've got an exclamation point. Lord, save us. We're going to drown. Now in Mark, Luke says it the same way. Master, Master, we're going to drown. Exclamation point. What's funny is in Mark's recollection of it, it says, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Question mark. Right there, that does matter. When you look and when you see, we're going to drown, exclamation point, and then you've got, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? It's a different mindset. You're starting to question Jesus. Jesus, don't you care about me? I'm going through this storm. I know. I'm glad you got your nap. We came to wake you up. But don't you care that we're about to drown? And then Matthew and Luke are like, we're going to drown. How we cry out to God does matter. When you start questioning, and I know that may sound so minute, but it's huge. When we start questioning, my buddy Wes Butler always said, our God's big enough to handle our anger. Our God is big enough to handle our frustrations and all the things. But knowing when the storm comes, don't let your view of God change because of your circumstances. Cry out to Him, but don't question Him. Because God is always in control. The other thing that we need to understand, not only do we need to make sure we have the foundation, don't let our circumstances change, but the other part we see in the storm, keep going in Matthew, is Matthew chapter 14. What I love about the flow of this Matthew chapter 14 is Jesus has experienced his friend John the Baptist dying. He's experiencing feeding 5,000 people. And then we get to another time where the storm starts to change. Matthew chapter 14, beginning verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up upon a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves, because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come on," Jesus said. Then Peter got out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind and the storm, he was afraid and began to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand, caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" It's very important. This is where I may lose some of you. It's very important. I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. everybody's storms and how we handle it are different. The worst thing that we can do as Christians is to say, hey, you know what? Your storm isn't big enough to worry about. Your storm is too small. We need to understand everybody handles storms differently. Some people, it doesn't bother them. There's a reason people make a killing as storm chasers. They love it. There's a reason some dogs don't mind it, and there's some that you got to give them a pill so they can handle it. Everybody handles storms differently. But the biggest thing is when those storms come, because we know they're going to, is to focus on Jesus. When the wind started to come, that's when Peter looked away and he fell. The people that were, I'm sure the disciples on the boat when Jesus was sleeping, knowing that everything is still in control, and wake up, I'm sure they were wigging out. But Peter at least was strong enough, you know what, to get out of the boat. Because I've said it all along, my favorite part of that story is there's 3 or 4 other, however many other disciples were in the boat that day that cannot say they walked on water. Peter can, because he got out of the boat. But we need to understand, even though we think everything's calm and cool and collective and walking on the boat, we've got to be ready to stay focused when the winds start hitting us. So, now I'm going to tell you something. This may, like I said, YouTube people may lose their mind. I love First Financial and they hand them out. I'm going to tell you, I don't eat black-eyed peas. I'm not going to put my faith in black-eyed peas for my good year. And I don't believe that if I open this up, I'm going to have bad luck. Now, some of y'all that believe in superstitions are losing your minds right now. People on YouTube are like, oh my goodness, we're about to lose it. I don't believe in superstitions. Now, black-eyed peas may taste good, but I almost rebuke them just because I'm not going to eat a pea thinking it's going to make my new year good. But, here, and some people it's superstition. But what we need to understand is God is kind of like this umbrella. The storm's going to come. When we get outside of it, we get wet. When we get outside of it, stuff can hit us. And sometimes the storm's not coming from above, it's coming from the side. And we've got to be ready for it. But the other thing is sometimes we've got to put it over other people. We've got to put it over other people. We've got to be the one holding the umbrella. When they can't do it, we put it over other people. That's what following Jesus is about. It's not looking at the storm, but it's understanding, staying under the protection of who Jesus is. And when struggles come, and they may not be able to handle it, you put it over for them. Last week we talked about being the church. That's what the church does. These presents, kids can't have Christmas. That is a storm for them. That's a storm for the parents. That's who Jesus is. No matter the storm, it was so cool. And I'm almost done. Coming over here, on the way, Casting Crowns has a song called Praise You in the Storm. So I'm driving in, I get Casting Crowns on Pandora. Kid you not, about the place I ran out of gas by Joe Posey's house. Praise You in the Storm kicks on. It's ran through all these other songs, and just right outside where Joe Posey lives, Praise You in the Storm came on. And it's so hard, human nature, to praise God during a storm. It's a lot easier to throw question marks. But the explanation, oh my gosh. The line and the dot. The line and the dot means so much, because what I love about John, even though he says, I've overcome the world in 16, those same folks in 14 says, you know what? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except for me. And I've got a mansion for you ready because you've trusted me. No matter the storm, this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. And so my challenge this week and my encouragement this week is the reason our God's not boring is no matter what the color of the radar is in our life, whether it's green and it's just raining, yellow or heavy red, no matter what the storm is, God never leaves us. And so this morning, you may be going through the storm and you've been under the umbrella. Or maybe you've been out of the umbrella. Let me praise that. Get under. Know that He's not ever gone anywhere. He is right there with you. And we as a church want to be right there with you. Because I want to tell you, hell hitting you in the side of the leg hurts. Life coming at you from the side hurts. But knowing that a God loves us and walks with us all the way is comfort that we can take in. That knowing our God's not boring because He loves us and He will never leave us or forsake us. I ask Pat to come and play. And I just encourage you, hopefully you're going to see an umbrella this week because it rains. But when you see that umbrella, remember, no matter the storm, it's kind of like playing time. Nobody complains about playing time until it's their kid. When I was coaching. Nobody complains about power being out until it's their power out. But we need to be, so what I'm saying is when, no matter what your storm is, I may not understand it. Somebody else may not understand it. But know that we are here to help put that umbrella over you during your storm. And to lift you up and pray for you, because that's what the church does. So maybe you pray for whatever it is that you need as Pat plays. You may stand or come.